It was just past noon, and the school bell had echoed across the courtyard, releasing a wave of students into the afternoon sun. The atmosphere was loud, energetic, typical of a high school that had just dismissed. Laughter mixed with the chatter, sneaker soles squeaked against the pavement, and phones came out as students captured moments with friends before heading home. Among the crowd, unnoticed at first, an elderly woman made her way slowly along the sidewalk in front of the school's main gate. She wore a neat gray coat, held her head high, and carried a folder tucked under her arm. Her steps were deliberate, but graceful. Her silver hair was pulled into a bun, and she had the kind of quiet dignity that made a few students glance at her with curiosity. But only a few. Most ignored her. A group of teenagers standing near the benches noticed her too, but not with respect. 3 boys, seniors, known for their cocky behavior and for being the self-declared kings of the campus, started nudging each other. Their ringleader, Chad, was tall, always had a smirk, and lived for attention. He squinted at the woman, nudged his friend Trevor, and whispered something that made them burst into laughter. Then he walked over, loud enough for people nearby to hear. "Hey, Grandma," Chad said mockingly, "you lose your bingo card or just looking for the library?" Some students chuckled. The woman glanced at him calmly, without emotion. "You know," he continued, "you really shouldn't be wandering around schools. Kinda creepy, if you ask me." His voice raised at the end so others could hear. Trevor added, "Maybe she thinks it's bring your grandkid to school day. Except, she forgot the grandkid." More laughter. They circled around her like vultures. The woman didn't move. She simply watched them, her face unreadable. Chad tried to grab the folder under her arm, but she pulled it back swiftly, far quicker than anyone expected. His hand missed, and for a second, his smug expression faltered. "Oh, she's feisty," one of them muttered. A crowd began to form. Phones came out. Students smelled drama. But what none of them knew, what not even the teachers rushing over from the side entrance knew, was that this woman wasn't just some random passerby. Her name was Eleanor Maddox, retired Supreme Court judge, known nationally, feared in the courtroom, respected across legal circles. The school had invited her for a special program that afternoon to speak about justice and ethics. She was to address the entire senior class. But none of these bullies had any clue. They only saw a woman with gray hair and slow steps and assumed she was weak. A mistake, a big one. Before the teachers arrived, Judge Maddox finally spoke, her voice firm, calm, and cutting through the crowd like a razor. "Is this how your school teaches respect?" she asked, eyes fixed directly on Chad. His smirk returned, but it looked forced now. "Just a joke, lady. Lighten up." "No," she said. "You don't get to dismiss disrespect as a joke. That's what cowards do." The crowd grew quiet. You see someone who looks old and think it's a license to mock them. What you don't realize is that every wrinkle you see has been earned through battles you're too young to understand. Chad shifted uncomfortably. So did Trevor. A few students lowered their phones. "My name is Judge Eleanor Maddox," she continued, pulling the folder out and opening it. "And I was invited here today by your principal, Mr. Keene, to speak about moral integrity. But it appears I've been given an unexpected opportunity to witness a lack of it firsthand." At that very moment, Principal Keene appeared from the front doors, breathless and wide-eyed, pushing through the crowd.
"Judge Maddox!"
"I am so sorry." She raised her hand. "It's quite all right. We were just getting to know each other." The principal's expression darkened when he saw who was surrounding her. "Chad, Trevor, Logan, my office." "Now, wait," Judge Maddox said. "Let them stay. Let them hear." The crowd parted as she walked up the school steps. She turned and faced them all. "These boys thought I was weak because I'm old. They thought that made it okay to humiliate me. But I've sentenced gang leaders, corporate criminals, and men twice your size with twice your arrogance. You know what they had in common with you? They all thought no one would hold them accountable." The courtyard was silent now. Not a laugh. Not a whisper. "Power doesn't come from mocking others," she said. "It comes from standing up for them. The next time you see someone alone, someone different, someone quiet, ask yourself what it costs you to be kind instead of cruel. Because the law might not always be watching, but your conscience always is." Chad's face was pale. Trevor looked down. Phone slowly lowered. Principal Keene nodded. "Judge Maddox, would you like to proceed to the auditorium?" She smiled gently. "Yes. Let's begin." As she entered the building, the crowd parted like the Red Sea. Students followed her not out of curiosity now, but out of respect. They had come to watch a speech, but they had already witnessed a lesson. one they wouldn't forget. The boys who had laughed were now silent. And Judge Maddox, she didn't need revenge. She had something stronger: dignity, truth, and the power to change minds, not by shouting, but by standing firm in who she was. The elderly woman they tried to humiliate had just schooled them all. Power doesn't come from mocking others, it comes from standing up for them. Those words echoed like thunder through the hearts of every student present that day. But for Eleanor Maddox, they weren't just words, they were a philosophy crafted through a lifetime of service to justice, honor, and unshakable principle. And as she stood on those worn school steps, an elderly woman to some, but a fortress of truth to others, she felt the weight of a moment that had arrived not by accident, but by design. For life has a strange and subtle way of orchestrating its most powerful lessons through confrontation. And today was no exception, because when Chad and his friends encircled her with laughter and arrogance, expecting a fragile reaction, or perhaps a flustered retreat, they encountered something they had never experienced before: unflinching calm, dignity beyond comprehension, and a gaze that did not reflect fear, but a mirror to their own ignorance. And what they didn't understand, what they could not understand, was that Eleanor had seen cruelty before, far more venomous than teenage taunts, had stood in courtrooms across the country with criminals who wore the same smirk Chad now wore, had stared down lawyers who tried to rattle her with ego and force. But never once did she falter. Never once did she compromise the values that her father, a bricklayer with cracked hands and quiet wisdom, had once whispered into her young ears. Treat no one as less than human, and fear no one who wears arrogance like armor. And as she watched the crowd grow, phones rise, the giggles ripple through the air, Eleanor saw not humiliation, but opportunity, because the world was watching, and sometimes the best courtroom is the unexpected one. And she let Chad talk, let Trevor chuckle, let the poison drip out through their immaturity. And when the moment came to speak, when silence fell not out of respect but suspense, she drew breath not from anger, but from purpose, and delivered a truth that cut deeper than any insult ever could, reminding not just the boys, but the entire generation standing before her that mocking the vulnerable is the mark of a weak man pretending to be strong. And kindness isn't weakness. It's restraint, it's control, it's courage in its purest form. And as she walked into that auditorium minutes later, her presence commanding in a way no stage lights could manufacture, the students didn't see a speaker. They saw a standard, a reminder of what character looks like when age no longer competes with image. And though Chad sat in the back with arms folded and pride bruised, even he could not escape the ripple that had been sent through his world. For humiliation does not come from being confronted. It comes from realizing you were wrong in front of everyone and having no defense but silence. And Eleanor spoke to them that day, not about laws or court cases, but about choice. The choice to be decent when it's easier to be cruel. The choice to help when it's safer to hide. The choice to become someone who builds others rather than tears them down. And as she shared stories from her life, of men who had everything but lacked character, of women who had nothing but walked with nobility, of children who rose from trauma to greatness, she looked into their eyes not as a judge, not as an elder, but as a witness to what they could become. And though many applauded when her speech ended, though the principal offered a standing ovation, and the teachers murmured praise, the real victory was the silence that lingered long after the noise faded, because that silence meant they were thinking, processing, changing. And later that day, when Chad walked past the same bench where he had mocked her just hours earlier, he glanced at the spot with a different weight in his chest, not fear, but shame, the beginning of transformation. And he didn't laugh this time, didn't joke with Trevor, or throw his bag over his shoulder like a shield. He just walked. And for the first time in a long while, he listened, not to music, not to his friends, but to his conscience. And though Eleanor Maddox would leave that school the same way she came, with grace and solitude, she left behind something far more powerful than a speech. She left behind a memory, a confrontation that became a mirror, and a truth that now lived in every hallway, every bench, every moment a student paused before speaking, wondering whether their words were building or breaking. And in that way, Eleanor didn't just walk into a school that day, she changed it. They all thought no one would hold them accountable, but justice never sleeps, and integrity never grows old. And as Eleanor Maddox stood before the students with eyes that had seen decades of courtroom battles, political injustice, and the raw face of human cruelty, she understood better than anyone the cost of silence in the face of wrongdoing. Because silence is not always neutral. It can be complicit. It can be a cloak for cowardice. And she had spent her life being the voice that shattered that silence, whether for a neglected child, a wrongly accused man, or a victim seeking dignity. And that's why, when those three boys tried to humiliate her, laughing in the faces of respect, empathy, and decency, they had unknowingly walked straight into a test of character they would fail in front of everyone. But more importantly, she knew this wasn't just about three boys. This was about a culture that had begun to reward mockery, idolize ego, and overlook the damage done by casual cruelty. And if someone didn't stand up in moments like this, those values would continue to poison the next generation. So she used that unexpected stage not to scold, but to awaken. Because holding people accountable isn't about punishment. It's about growth, and the irony that she, a judge, was being judged by teenagers too young to understand the value of wisdom was not lost on her. But instead of bitterness, she offered them perspective. She opened a window into a world where strength is measured not in how loudly you can laugh at someone weaker, but in how courageously you can protect them. And as she addressed the students, she wasn't merely recounting legal history or talking about her title. She was inviting them to remember their own power to make moments matter, to choose integrity when no one was watching, to be the person others feel safe around rather than afraid of. Because if the boys had stopped for even 1 second to ask her name, to greet her with basic human kindness, they would have discovered not an old woman, but a force of nature who had spent her life defending the very rights that allowed them to speak freely, to gather publicly, and to live with the privileges they took for granted. And Eleanor wasn't angry. They weren't the first to disrespect her, and wouldn't be the last. But she was disappointed, not because they failed a moral test, but because they failed themselves. They missed an opportunity to rise, and the very institution they stood in, a school, was supposed to be a place of learning, not just of facts and dates, but of character, humanity, and self-control. And by humiliating her, they revealed how much they still had to learn. So she chose not to respond with anger or legal authority. Though she had more of both than they could imagine, she responded with truth, with calm, and with the clarity of someone who had nothing to prove. And that's what made her powerful, not her robe or gavel, but her unshakable identity. Because when you know who you are, no insult can define you, no mockery can wound you, and no coward can steal your dignity. And that is what she wanted every student to remember, especially the ones who didn't speak up, the ones who stood by with phones in hand and laughter on their lips, but said nothing, did nothing, and let disrespect happen in front of them. Because their silence mattered too, and the next time they witnessed cruelty, she hoped they would remember this day, this lesson, and ask themselves if they would be bystanders again, or if they would be brave enough to stand up, not because someone told them to, but because it was right, because in the courtroom of life, we are all judged by our choices. And sometimes the most powerful verdicts come not from judges or lawyers, but from the quiet conviction in our own hearts. And as she concluded her talk in the auditorium, Eleanor didn't ask for applause or admiration. She asked for reflection, for every student to think about who they wanted to be when they left those walls, and the legacy they were already writing through their actions, their words, and their silence. And though the moment passed, and the crowd dispersed, and the day continued, something had shifted in that school, like a fog lifting, like a seed planted. Because Eleanor Maddox did not just challenge those boys. She challenged an entire culture to do better, to be better, and in that challenge, she did not humiliate them. She elevated them, because that's what real power does. It heals, it transforms, and it demands we look in the mirror, not just to see our reflection, but to measure our conscience.